It was a bright Saturday morning in the suburban streets of Westbrook Estates, a neighborhood that prided itself on its manicured lawns, white picket fences, and the kind of quiet where the loudest sound was the hum of a passing lawnmower. I had just stepped out of my house with my daughter Emily, a cheerful 5-year-old with curly brown hair and an insatiable curiosity for everything. The day was perfect, sunlight filtered through the trees, neighbors waved as they watered their gardens, and the air smelled faintly of freshly baked bread from the bakery down the street. Emily skipped ahead, chasing after a brightly colored butterfly that had landed on the edge of our front lawn. I called out to her, reminding her to stay close. But her laughter echoed through the cul-de-sac, and I found myself momentarily letting my guard down. It was one of those rare mornings when everything seemed peaceful, but in Westbrook Estates, peace was often an illusion, especially for those of us who had encountered the infamous HOA president, Mrs. Karen Wilkins, known around the neighborhood simply as HOA Karen. She was a woman in her early 50s, always impeccably dressed, with a perfectly coiffed hairstyle and a glare that could silence a rowdy child in seconds. She had a reputation for being overbearing, controlling, and increasingly volatile whenever she believed her rules were being violated. Over the years, she had become a nightmare for families who didn't toe the line, issuing citations for everything from a slightly overgrown lawn to a child's ball left on the sidewalk. I had always kept Emily close whenever HOA Karen was nearby, knowing from previous incidents that her temper was unpredictable. Today, however, I underestimated just how far her temper could escalate. That as I rounded the corner of our driveway, I noticed Karen's black SUV parked partially on the sidewalk. Her tinted windows reflected the morning sun, making it hard to see inside. From the look on her face, I could tell she was irritated about something. My heart sank. In past encounters, minor neighborhood disputes had escalated into shouting matches, and I didn't want Emily to witness yet another confrontation. Emily, oblivious to the tension, ran toward the vehicle, chasing the butterfly that had landed near Karen's car. She giggled, her tiny hands reaching out toward the delicate wings. Completely unaware of the danger, I shouted her name, sprinting toward her. But the moment stretched into an unbearable slow-motion scene. Karen, sitting in the driver's seat, saw Emily and immediately slammed her foot on the accelerator. It wasn't fast, but it was enough. Emily stumbled backward, startled by the sudden movement of the vehicle. My scream caught in my throat as I realized what was happening. Karen was not stopping. She was deliberately driving toward my child. Time slowed. Emily froze, her little body tense, eyes wide with fear. I ran faster than I ever had, reaching out to grab her. But before I could, the SUV jolted forward, striking Emily's leg with a sickening thud. She let out a piercing scream that split through the serene morning air. Neighbors who had been watering their lawns or checking their mail suddenly turned in alarm. Some dropped their tools, others ran toward the commotion. A few brave souls shouted at Karen to stop, banging on her car as she hesitated only for a second. That moment was terrifyingly surreal. Karen's expression didn't show fear or regret, it showed determination. She attempted to reverse the vehicle, seemingly intending to drive off, but the front bumper had caught on Emily's shoe, leaving her momentarily stuck. Emily was crying uncontrollably, her tiny body shaking as she tried to pull free. I finally reached her, scooping her up into my arms. She clung to me, sobbing and pointing at Karen. She hit me, Mommy. She tried to run away. Her words were fragmented but full of fear. I could feel the warmth of her tears soaking my shirt, and a wave of anger and panic surged through me. Karen, realizing that she was surrounded by neighbors now, slammed her foot on the brake and slowly rolled back into the driveway of her own house. She didn't step out immediately. Instead, she sat there, staring at us with a mixture of annoyance and something darker and almost predatory satisfaction at the chaos she had caused. Neighbors began calling 911 as I held Emily close, whispering reassurances while my own heart raced. You're safe now, baby. Mommy's got you. It's okay. Her sobs gradually subsided into whimpers, but the terror in her eyes lingered. The situation escalated quickly, drawing in people from all over the block. A neighbor, Mr. Thompson, a retired military man, yelled at Karen, demanding she get out of the car. Others joined, calling her a menace, insisting that the police had been called. It was a chaotic scene. The once peaceful cul-de-sac had transformed into a battlefield of shouts, sirens, and the echo of Emily's cries. Through it all, Karen remained inside her vehicle, glaring at everyone, as if the entire world had conspired against her. Her aura of control, so carefully maintained through intimidation, had shattered, revealing a raw, reckless volatility. Within minutes, police sirens pierced the tension-filled air. Officers arrived, quickly assessing the scene. Emily clung to me, her small hands wrapped around my neck, as the first responders rushed to check on her injuries. The sight of the flashing lights and uniformed officers brought a mix of relief and renewed fear. My daughter had survived, but the trauma was immediate and deep. Karen was finally ordered out of her SUV. She resisted initially, muttering angrily, her hands shaking as officers guided her to the curb. The neighbors watched, a mix of disbelief, anger, and vindication on their faces. That morning, the serenity of Westbrook Estates had been shattered. What had begun as an ordinary Saturday had turned into a nightmare, one that would haunt our family and the community for months to come. Emily was safe physically, but the psychological scars would take much longer to heal. And for HOA Karen, the law had finally caught up with her recklessness, but the story of that terrifying morning would be shared and retold. In the neighborhood, a chilling reminder of how quickly civility could turn into chaos. The aftermath of that Saturday morning was a surreal blur. Emily, my little girl who had only minutes before been laughing and chasing butterflies, now sat quietly on the living room couch, wrapped in a blanket with a cold pack pressed to her leg. The pain had subsided enough for her to stop wailing, but the fear in her eyes was palpable. She clung to her favorite stuffed rabbit, its fur matted with tears. And every time she heard a car door slam outside, she flinched, whispering, "Mommy, she's coming back, isn't she?" The police had stayed longer than I expected. Officers interviewed me multiple times, taking notes with a precision that was both comforting and exhausting. They asked for every detail of the incident, the time it happened, the sequence of events, descriptions of Karen's vehicle, the behavior she exhibited, and any previous encounters that could demonstrate a pattern of aggressive or reckless behavior. I recounted the events as clearly as I could, my voice shaking at times, the memory of Emily being struck replaying vividly in my mind. Emily's words from that morning, "She hit me, Mommy, she tried to run away," kept echoing. Each repetition made my blood boil. The officers exchanged glances as I finished my account. One of them, a middle-aged woman with a calm but firm tone, assured me, "We'll handle this. It's clear that your daughter was endangered, and we're documenting everything. The HOA president's actions are not acceptable. She will face legal consequences." Meanwhile, the neighborhood was buzzing. Text messages, phone calls, and social media posts about the incident spread faster than wildfire. Some neighbors had witnessed the incident firsthand. Others had arrived moments after, but the consensus was unanimous. Karen Wilkins had crossed a line that no one should ever cross. The once quiet cul-de-sac had transformed into a center of outrage and fear. Mrs. Henderson, who lived directly across the street, came over shortly after the police had left. Her hands shook as she recounted what she had seen. "I've never seen anything like that in all my years here," she said. "I couldn't believe my eyes. She just drove at her like it was nothing. And then she tried to leave." Her voice cracked as she spoke, anger and disbelief mixing in every word. By mid-afternoon, more neighbors gathered on their lawns, whispering about HOA Karen's recklessness. Some shared stories of prior incidents, small escalations that now seemed ominously prophetic. There was the time she had called the police because a child had played soccer slightly past the curb. There was the incident with a dog being on the wrong side of a fence. In isolation, these stories were frustrating, even petty, but in the context of today, they painted a picture of a woman whose temper and sense of control had grown dangerously extreme. The police returned later in the day to formally take statements from several witnesses. Each person's testimony built a narrative of Karen's escalating hostility, the slamming of doors, the shouting, the aggressive driving toward a child. The officers documented the damage to Emily's shoe, the scuff marks on the asphalt, and even skid marks that showed the vehicle had jolted forward unexpectedly. Every piece of evidence painted a damning picture. Meanwhile, I was trying to comfort Emily, who refused to speak to anyone outside our immediate family. She drew pictures on scraps of paper, her tiny hands carefully tracing images of cars and flowers. But every time she drew a car, her pencil would break from the pressure of her grip. Her therapist, who I called later that evening, explained gently that Emily had experienced a traumatic event and that her reactions were normal, albeit frightening. She may relive it in small ways, through play or drawing, the therapist said. The key is reassurance and creating a sense of safety. While the neighborhood processed what had happened, HOA Karen retreated into her house. From behind curtained windows, she watched, probably calculating her next move. But the officers had left a notice on her door, informing her that she was under investigation for reckless endangerment and child endangerment. The thought that Karen could face legal consequences brought a small measure of relief, but the community tension was far from over. By evening, local news crews had arrived, filming the cul-de-sac and interviewing neighbors. The story quickly made the local evening broadcast, and within hours, it spread online. The headline was sensational but accurate. HOA president hits child with vehicle in suburban neighborhood. Police investigate. Some neighbors worried about privacy, but many felt the exposure was necessary to prevent Karen from repeating her actions in another neighborhood or against another family. The HOA board convened an emergency meeting the next day. Emails, calls, and online petitions flooded their inboxes, demanding Karen's immediate removal from her position. Board members, who had long tolerated her aggressive tendencies in the name of community standards, now faced public scrutiny. The meeting was tense, filled with accusations, denials, and heated arguments. Some board members claimed they had no power to remove her, citing bylaw, while others argued that her actions had gone beyond any reasonable interpretation of HOA authority. In the midst of all this, I focused on Emily's recovery. She had a mild bruise on her leg and was prescribed some rest. but emotionally, the healing process was far more complex. I set up a small safe zone in our home, a space where she could play, read, or draw without fear. Every time the doorbell rang or a car passed by, she would pause, tense, and glance toward me for reassurance. It was heartbreaking to see her innocence marred by an act of sheer recklessness. The local authorities informed me that HOA Karen would likely face multiple charges: reckless endangerment of a minor, assault with a vehicle, and attempted fleeing the scene. The fact that multiple neighbors had witnessed the incident, coupled with Emily's statements and physical evidence, made it difficult for her to evade consequences. While I felt a small sense of vindication, I knew this was only the beginning of a long and arduous process. As the day drew to a close, our quiet neighborhood had transformed forever. The streets, once a symbol of suburban serenity, were now marked by the memory of that terrifying morning. Emily slept fitfully, clutching her rabbit tightly, while I sat beside her, exhausted but vigilant, knowing that the road ahead involved not only legal battles, but the painstaking work of restoring a child's sense of safety. Westbrook Estates would never forget that day, nor would it forget the dark side of control and entitlement personified by HOA Karen. The incident had exposed a fault line in the neighborhood's veneer of perfection, a reminder that even in the most idyllic settings, danger can lurk behind the polished facade of authority. And for Emily, the world had shifted in a single, horrifying moment-to-moment that would shape her childhood, in ways that would take years to fully understand. The days following the incident felt like living in a nightmare that refused to end. Emily's trauma was evident in every little thing she did: hesitation when crossing the street, flinching at car horns, or even glancing nervously at our driveway whenever a vehicle approached. Every step forward in her recovery was tempered by the knowledge that HOA Karen had not yet faced full accountability. And as the legal wheels began to turn, I realized that the nightmare was only growing. Within 48 hours, our lawyer had filed a formal complaint, citing reckless endangerment and child endangerment. The case would involve multiple parties: the local police, the district attorney's office, and of course, the HOA board, whose failure to act responsibly had contributed to the neighborhood's escalating tension. Every document we submitted, every witness we brought forward, painted Karen in the same terrifying light: a woman who had weaponized her authority, her vehicle, and her sense of entitlement against an innocent child. The HOA community meetings became a battleground. Word of the incident had spread far beyond our cul-de-sac, and emotions were running high. Families who had tolerated Karen's overbearing behavior for years were finally speaking out. Parents shared stories of unfair citations, threats over trivial matters, and public humiliation. The meetings were no longer about landscaping rules or mailbox regulations. They were about fear, accountability, and justice. Karen, of course, maintained her facade of innocence. She sat at the board meetings with a composed expression, arms folded, offering explanations that sounded rehearsed. She claimed the incident was an accident, that she didn't see the child, and that the witnesses were exaggerating. But the mounting evidence told a far more damning story. The photos of Emily's shoe, the skid marks on the asphalt, and the testimony of neighbors painted a picture impossible to deny. Even her fellow board members, who had once deferred to her, were now questioning how long they could justify protecting her. The legal process was grueling. I had to recount the incident in precise detail for police reports, attorneys, and eventually in court depositions. Each retelling brought the memory back vividly: the sound of Emily's cry, the sickening thud as her leg was struck, the chilling moment when Karen attempted to drive off while my child was trapped. It was emotionally exhausting, but necessary. I had to ensure that the story was documented accurately, so no loophole could let her walk away. As the court date approached, the community's anger grew. Social media was flooded with posts denouncing Karen's behavior, some demanding criminal charges, others calling for her removal from the HOA entirely. The tension in the neighborhood became palpable. People whispered on their lawns. Parents warned children to stay clear of Karen's house, and some neighbors even installed cameras to ensure there were no further incidents. What had once been a peaceful suburb had transformed into a community on edge. When the court day finally arrived, the courtroom was packed. Friends, neighbors, and concerned community members filled every seat, eager to witness accountability. Karen entered, impeccably dressed, projecting her usual air of control, but there was a flicker of unease in her eyes. She was no longer in her SUV with tinted windows, shielding her from the world. She was exposed, facing both legal authority and the collective judgment of the community she had terrorized. Emily and I sat together in the front row. She held my hand tightly, her small fingers entwined with mine, her eyes wide as the proceedings began. The prosecutor presented a detailed account of the incident, the timeline, witness statements, and photographs of Emily's injury. The narrative left little room for ambiguity. Karen's reckless behavior was evident, and the courtroom reacted to each detail with audible gasps and murmurs of disbelief. Then came the testimony from neighbors who had witnessed the incident firsthand. Mr. Thompson, the retired military man who had shouted at Karen to stop that fateful morning, recounted his memory with precision. "I saw her accelerate toward a child," he testified. "She didn't hesitate. I banged on the hood to make her stop. She tried to back up but didn't care about the child's safety. Each statement reinforced the image of a woman who had disregarded the life of a mother's worst fear realized in public view. Karen's defense tried to argue that the incident was an accident, a misjudgment in driving. But her pattern of hostility toward the neighborhood and her own testimony about minor disputes undermined any claims of innocence. The courtroom was tense, the atmosphere thick with anticipation. Every time Karen opened her mouth to speak, murmurs rippled through the audience. A collective disbelief at her audacity. Outside the courthouse, the community had gathered in support of Emily. Parents held banners and signs, many reading, "Justice for Emily," or "No more HOA Karen." The solidarity was overwhelming. Neighbors who had previously been passive were now vocal, united by the knowledge that Karen's actions had crossed an unthinkable line. Local news crews captured the protest, amplifying the story beyond the boundaries of Westbrook Estates. Meanwhile, I continued to focus on Emily's emotional recovery. Her therapist recommended daily routines, safe spaces, and gradual exposure to situations that triggered fear. Every step forward was a battle, but also a testament to her resilience. I watched as she slowly began to smile again, playfully chasing her stuffed rabbit or drawing pictures of her friends. Yet, the memory of that day lingered a shadow over her childhood that required vigilance and care. As the legal proceedings progressed, Karen's behavior became increasingly erratic. She lashed out at board members, neighbors, and even her own family, refusing to accept responsibility. Her entitlement, once masked by authority and decorum, had transformed into desperation. But for the first time, the walls she had built around herself were cracking, and the community, long fearful, was no longer intimidated. By the end of Section 3, it was clear that HOA Karen's reign of terror was unraveling. The legal system had caught up with her, neighbors were emboldened, and Emily's voice, though small, had become a symbol of resilience. What remained was the final reckoning, ensuring that Karen could no longer pose a threat, and that justice, long delayed, would finally be served. The morning of the verdict felt heavier than any day I had experienced since that terrifying Saturday. The courtroom, familiar now from previous hearings, was tense with anticipation. Emily clung to my hand, her small fingers trembling but her gaze steady. She had come so far since the incident. Her therapist had helped her navigate her fear, and while trauma still lingered in subtle ways, her bravery was undeniable. Today, that courage would be reflected not only in her eyes, but in the outcome we were all hoping for: justice. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. Karen Wilkins, the infamous HOA president whose reckless actions had traumatized a 5-year-old and terrified an entire neighborhood, looked as composed as ever on the surface, but there was a tension in her shoulders, a flicker of vulnerability that had never been present before. This was no longer a mere HOA dispute. This was accountability. Her aura of untouchable authority had been stripped away by witnesses, police reports, and the stark reality of her own actions. The prosecution summarized the case. Karen had intentionally accelerated her SUV toward a child, struck her leg, and attempted to flee the scene while ignoring the danger she had caused. Multiple neighbors had testified, providing corroborating accounts of the incident. Photographs, witness statements, and even Karen's own prior aggressive behavior within the HOA reinforced the pattern of recklessness and intimidation. Then came Emily's statement. I had asked the court if she could speak, and the judge allowed it, emphasizing that her voice mattered. With a shaky but determined voice, Emily recounted what had happened. "She hit me, and she tried to drive away. I was scared, but Mommy caught me. I don't want her to hurt anyone else." The courtroom was silent, absorbing the gravity of a 5-year-old's courage. I held back tears, overwhelmed by her bravery and by the long, terrifying journey that had brought us here. The defense attempted to downplay the incident, labeling it an accident, a misunderstanding, but their words fell flat in the face of overwhelming evidence. Even their attempts to portray Emily as exaggerating were met with disbelief. The consistency of her statements, along with the testimonies of multiple adults, left no room for doubt. Karen's expression shifted between indignation and panic, her carefully constructed facade was crumbling. When the judge finally spoke, the words carried the weight of justice, long overdue. "Karen Wilkins, your actions endangered the life of a child, violated the safety of this community, and demonstrated a reckless disregard for the law. You are hereby found guilty of reckless endangerment of a minor, child endangerment, and attempting to flee the scene of an accident involving a child." Gasps echoed through the courtroom. I felt a release of tension so intense it brought tears to my eyes. Emily squeezed my hand, a small but triumphant smile breaking across her face. For the first time since that morning, she felt a sense of safety that wasn't just temporary. Justice had validated her. Fear and courage. Karen was sentenced to probation, mandated community service, and required to undergo anger management and parenting classes. While some argued the punishment could have been harsher, it was undeniable that her HOA reign had effectively ended. The board was compelled to vote her out, and she was stripped of all authority in the neighborhood. For years, Westbrook Estates would remember that the day of reckoning had finally come. Outside the courthouse, the neighborhood gathered. People who had once whispered in fear now spoke openly, sharing relief and support. Banners of solidarity remained, and many embraced, acknowledging the strength it had taken to confront a person who had once instilled terror in our community. Conversations that had been muted now flowed freely, with parents exchanging advice on protecting their children and advocating for safe spaces. Emily's recovery continued at home, but with a renewed sense of hope. She returned to her routines, gradually playing outside, drawing, and laughing more freely. Yet the incident left its mark, a reminder that vigilance and awareness were essential, even in seemingly safe communities. We spoke openly about feelings, fears, and boundaries, using the experience to teach Emily resilience and empowerment. As for HOA Karen, her influence faded rapidly. Neighbors no longer tolerated her temper. Her reputation as a dangerous authority figure solidified, and her attempts to assert control were met with community resistance. What had been a quiet, well-manicured neighborhood had learned an essential lesson. No one, regardless of title or position, was above accountability, and the safety of children was paramount. Months later, as Emily skipped down our driveway chasing butterflies carefully observed, but free from fear, I realized how far we had come. The trauma of that day would always remain part of our story, but it no longer defined us. It had sparked community unity, legal accountability, and personal growth for my daughter and me. Westbrook Estates, once a portrait of suburban perfection, now carried a new narrative, one where courage, resilience, and justice prevailed over recklessness and unchecked authority. And as I watched Emily laugh, her innocence restored, I knew that despite the horrors of that morning, we had emerged stronger, wiser, and more united than ever before. In the end, justice was not just a legal verdict. It was the restoration of safety, trust, and peace for a neighborhood, a family, and most importantly, a brave little girl who refused to be silenced.